It was a cold, rainy evening, and the streets were nearly empty. A young woman, dressed in a simple jacket and jeans, was walking briskly down the sidewalk. Her face was pale, and her hands were trembling slightly. She looked over her shoulder every few steps, as if she was being followed. The truth was, she was running, not from someone, but from something. Life had been harsh to her lately, and she felt like she had no other choice but to take desperate measures. Earlier that day, she had walked into a small convenience store. Her stomach growled with hunger, and her pockets were empty. She had no job, no money, and no one to turn to. As she stood in the aisle, staring at a loaf of bread, her mind raced. She knew what she was about to do was wrong, but the ache in her stomach was louder than her conscience. With a quick glance around, she slipped the bread into her bag and walked toward the door. But before she could step outside, a strong voice called out, "Stop right there." Her heart sank. The store owner, a middle-aged man with a stern face, had seen her. He walked over, his eyes narrowing as he demanded she open her bag. She hesitated, but there was no way out. When the bread was revealed, the owner shook his head in disappointment. "I'm calling the police," he said firmly. The young woman felt tears welling up in her eyes. She wanted to explain, to tell him how hard things had been, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, she stood there, silent and ashamed, as the owner dialed the police. Within minutes, a patrol car pulled up, and an officer stepped out. He was tall, with a calm demeanor, and his eyes scanned the scene quickly. The store owner explained what had happened, and the officer nodded, turning to the young woman. "Is this true?" he asked gently. She nodded, unable to meet his gaze. The officer sighed and said, "I'm going to have to take you in." He guided her to the patrol car, his tone firm but not unkind. As they drove to the station, the young woman stared out the window, her mind a whirlwind of fear and regret. She wondered what would happen next, how she would explain herself, and if anyone would even care. At the station, the officer led her to a small room and asked her to sit down. He took a seat across from her and began filling out some paperwork. The young woman fidgeted nervously, unsure of what to say or do. Finally, the officer looked up and asked, "Why did you do it?" She hesitated, then whispered, "I was hungry." Her voice was so soft that the officer had to lean forward to hear her. He studied her face for a moment, noticing the dark circles under her eyes and the way her hands shook. There was something about her that seemed different from the usual suspects he dealt with. Instead of lecturing her or rushing through the process, the officer paused. He asked her a few more questions, gently probing to understand her situation. She told him about losing her job, being unable to pay rent, and having no family or friends to help her. As she spoke, her voice cracked, and tears streamed down her face. The officer listened quietly, his expression softening. When she finished, he sat back in his chair, deep in thought. Then, without a word, he stood up and walked out of the room. The young woman's heart raced. Was he going to charge her? Would she end up in jail? She had no idea what to expect. A few minutes later, the officer returned, holding a small paper bag. He placed it on the table in front of her and said, "This is for you." Confused, she opened the bag and found a sandwich, a bottle of water, and a few snacks. Her eyes widened in surprise. "Eat," the officer said simply. "You look like you need it." The young woman stared at him, unsure of how to react. She hadn't expected kindness, especially not from someone in his position. Slowly, she picked up the sandwich and took a bite. It was the first real meal she'd had in days, and it tasted like heaven. As she ate, the officer sat back down and continued filling out the paperwork. When she finished eating, he looked at her and said, "I'm not going to charge you." Her eyes widened in disbelief. "But," he continued, "I want you to promise me something. Promise me you'll never do this again." There are better ways to get help, and I'll make sure you find them. The young woman nodded, tears streaming down her face once more. She couldn't believe what was happening. The officer stood up and handed her a card with the contact information for a local shelter and a food bank. Go there tomorrow, he said. They'll help you get back on your feet. As she left the station, the young woman felt a mix of emotions, relief, gratitude, and a glimmer of hope. She didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in a long time, she felt like maybe, just maybe, things could get better. Little did she know, this was only the beginning of a story that would change her life, and the officers, in ways neither of them could have imagined. The next morning, the young woman woke up on a thin mattress in the local shelter the officer had recommended. The room was small and crowded, but it was warm, and for the first time in weeks, she had slept without fear. She clutched the card the officer had given her, staring at the phone number for the food bank. Her stomach growled, reminding her of the meal she had eaten the night before. She felt a flicker of hope but also a deep sense of uncertainty. What if they turned her away? What if this was just another dead end? Still, she had promised the officer she would try. She got up, washed her face in the shared bathroom, and made her way to the food bank. The building was modest, with a sign that read, Community Help Center, hanging above the door. She hesitated for a moment, took a deep breath, and walked inside. A friendly woman at the front desk greeted her with a warm smile. How can I help you? She asked. The young woman nervously explained her situation, her voice barely above a whisper. The woman listened patiently, nodding along. When she finished, the woman handed her a form to fill out and said, We're here to help. Let's get you some food and see what else we can do. The young woman's eyes filled with tears. She hadn't expected such kindness. After filling out the form, she was given a bag of groceries, canned goods, fresh vegetables, and a loaf of bread. Come back anytime, the woman said. And if you need help with housing or work, we have resources for that too. For the first time in a long time, the young woman felt like she wasn't alone. She left the food bank with a renewed sense of determination. She would turn her life around, no matter how hard it was. Meanwhile, the officer who had shown her such compassion was back on duty, patrolling the same streets where he had found her the night before. His name wasn't important to the story, but his actions were. He had been a police officer for over a decade, and while he had seen his share of crime and hardship, something about the young woman had struck a chord with him. He couldn't stop thinking about her, the way she had trembled, the desperation in her eyes, and the quiet dignity she had maintained even in her lowest moment. As he drove through the neighborhood, he noticed a group of teenagers loitering near the convenience store where the young woman had been caught stealing. He pulled over and approached them, not to scold or arrest them, but to talk. He knew that many of the kids in this area came from tough backgrounds, and he believed that a little kindness could go a long way. Hey, he said, his tone friendly but firm. You guys hanging out here all day, or do you have plans? The teenagers looked at him warily, unsure of how to respond. One of them shrugged and said, Just chillin'. Why? The officer smiled. I know a place that's looking for volunteers. It's a community center not far from here. They could use some help organizing events, cleaning up, stuff like that. It's a good way to spend your time, and you might even learn something. The teenagers exchanged glances, intrigued but skeptical. What's in it for us? One of them asked. A chance to do something meaningful, the officer replied. And maybe a free meal or two. The teenagers laughed, but the officer could tell he had piqued their interest. He handed them a flyer with the community center's information and said, Think about it. It's better than standing around here all day. As he walked back to his patrol car, the officer felt a sense of satisfaction. He knew he couldn't solve all the problems in the neighborhood, but he believed in the power of small acts of kindness. He had seen it in the way the young woman had responded to his help, and he hoped to see it in others too. Later that day, the officer decided to check in on the young woman. He drove to the shelter and asked if she was there. The staff informed him that she had left earlier but had taken the information about the food bank and other resources. The officer nodded, relieved to hear that she was taking steps to improve her situation. As he left the shelter, he noticed a familiar figure walking down the street. It was the young woman, carrying a bag of groceries and heading toward a small park. He hesitated for a moment, then decided to approach her. "Hey," he said gently, not wanting to startle her. She turned around, her eyes widening in surprise when she saw him. "Officer. I didn't expect to see you here," she said, her voice tinged with gratitude. "I just wanted to check on you," he replied. "How are you doing?" She smiled faintly. "Better. I went to the food bank, like you said. They were really nice." The officer nodded, pleased to hear it. "That's good. And what about work? Have you thought about what you want to do next?" She sighed, looking down at the ground. "I don't know. I've been out of work for so long. I'm not sure where to start." The officer thought for a moment, then said, "There's a job fair happening at the community center next week. They're looking for people to fill all kinds of positions. Maybe you could check it out." Her eyes lit up with hope. "Really? That sounds amazing. Thank you." The officer smiled. "You're welcome. And remember, if you ever need help, don't hesitate to ask." As they parted ways, the young woman felt a surge of determination. She had a long road ahead of her, but for the first time in a long time, she felt like she had a chance. And the officer, watching her walk away, felt a sense of fulfillment. He knew he couldn't save everyone, but he had made a difference in one person's life, and that was enough. Little did they both know, their paths would cross again in ways neither of them could have predicted. The young woman spent the next few days preparing for the job fair the officer had mentioned. She borrowed a clean set of clothes from the shelter, practiced answering interview questions in front of a cracked mirror, and even wrote down a list of skills she could offer. It wasn't much, she had worked odd jobs here and there, mostly cleaning and waitressing, but she was determined to make the best of what she had. When the day of the job fair arrived, she woke up early, her stomach fluttering with nerves. She ate a small breakfast at the shelter, then made her way to the community center. The building was bustling with activity when she arrived. Tables were set up with signs from local businesses, and people in suits and uniforms stood behind them, ready to talk to job seekers. The young woman hesitated at the entrance, feeling out of place. Most of the other attendees looked more confident, more prepared. She took a deep breath, reminding herself why she was there, and stepped inside. She approached the first table, where a woman from a local grocery store was handing out flyers. "Hi," the young woman said, her voice shaky. "I'm looking for work. Do you have any openings?" The woman smiled kindly and handed her an application form. "We're always looking for hardworking people. Fill this out, and we'll be in touch." Encouraged by the interaction, the young woman moved on to the next table, and the next. She talked to representatives from a cleaning company, a restaurant, and even a daycare center. By the time she reached the last table, her hands were full of flyers and application forms. As she was about to leave, she noticed a familiar face near the entrance. It was the officer, standing by the door and chatting with one of the organizers. Her heart skipped a beat. She hadn't expected to see him here. The officer noticed her too and waved her over. "How's it going?" he asked, his tone warm and encouraging. "Good," she replied, holding up the stack of papers in her hands. "I talk to a lot of people. I'm just nervous, I guess." The officer nodded understandingly. "That's normal. But you're here, and that's what matters. You're taking steps to improve your life, and that takes courage." His words gave her a boost of confidence. "Thank you," she said softly. For everything. The officer smiled. You're welcome. And hey, if you ever need a reference, let me know. The young woman's eyes widened in surprise. Really? You'd do that for me? Of course, he replied. I believe in second chances. And I believe in you. His words stayed with her as she left the community center. For the first time in a long time, she felt like she had someone in her corner. Over the next few days, she filled out the application forms and dropped them off at the various businesses. Then, she waited. The days felt long, and the uncertainty was hard to bear, but she tried to stay positive. She spent her time volunteering at the shelter, helping to serve meals and clean the common areas. It gave her a sense of purpose and kept her mind off the waiting. One afternoon, as she was folding blankets in the shelter's storage room, her phone buzzed. It was an unknown number. Her hands trembled as she answered. Hello? Hi, this is Maria from Green Valley Grocery. We received your application, and we'd like to invite you for an interview. The young woman's heart raced. Really? That's great. When? How about tomorrow at 10 a.m.? I'll be there, she said quickly. Thank you so much. When she hung up, she felt a surge of excitement. This was her chance. She spent the rest of the day preparing, practicing her answers to potential interview questions and making sure her clothes were clean and presentable. The next morning, she arrived at the grocery store early. The manager, a middle-aged woman with a no-nonsense demeanor, greeted her and led her to a small office. The interview was short but thorough. The manager asked about her previous work experience, her availability, and why she wanted the job. The young woman answered honestly, explaining that she had been through a tough time but was determined to turn her life around. I just want a chance to prove myself, she said. The manager studied her for a moment, then nodded. We'll be in touch. The young woman left the store feeling hopeful but anxious. She knew she had done her best, but she also knew there were no guarantees. A few days later, her phone buzzed again. It was the grocery store. Her hands shook as she answered. We'd like to offer you the position, the manager said. Can you start on Monday? Tears of relief filled her eyes. Yes, she said quickly. Thank you. Thank you so much. When she hung up, she felt like a weight had been lifted off her shoulders. She had a job. A real job. It wasn't much, but it was a start. That evening, she decided to visit the park where she had last seen the officer. She wanted to thank him, to let him know that his kindness had made a difference. She sat on a bench, watching the sun set, and thought about how far she had come. As the sky turned orange and pink, she noticed a familiar figure walking toward her. It was the officer. He smiled when he saw her. Hey, he said, sitting down beside her. How are you? I got the job, she said, her voice filled with gratitude. At the grocery store. I start on Monday. The officer's face lit up. That's amazing. I'm so proud of you. She looked at him, tears in her eyes. I couldn't have done it without you. You gave me a chance when no one else would. Thank you. The officer shook his head. You did this. I just pointed you in the right direction. You're the one who took the steps. They sat in silence for a moment, watching the sun dip below the horizon. The young woman felt a sense of peace she hadn't felt in a long time. She knew there would still be challenges ahead, but for the first time, she felt ready to face them. And as the stars began to appear in the night sky, she realized that this was just the beginning of a new chapter in her life, one filled with hope, possibility, and the kindness of strangers. The young woman's first day at the grocery store was a mix of excitement and nerves. She arrived early, wearing the cleanest clothes she owned, and introduced herself to the manager, Maria. The store was small but busy, with customers coming in and out throughout the day. Her job was simple: stocking shelves, helping customers find items, and occasionally working the cash register. It wasn't glamorous, but it was honest work, and she was grateful for it. As the days turned into weeks, she began to settle into her new routine. She enjoyed the sense of purpose that came with having a job, and the steady paycheck allowed her to save a little money each week. She even started making small talk with her coworkers, who were kind and welcoming. For the first time in a long time, she felt like she belonged somewhere. One afternoon, as she was arranging cans on a shelf, she noticed a familiar face walking down the aisle. It was the officer. Her heart skipped a beat, and she quickly stood up, brushing her hands on her apron. "Hey," he said with a warm smile. "I was in the neighborhood and thought I'd stop by to see how you're doing." "I'm good," she replied, her face lighting up. "Really good. Thank you for checking on me." The officer glanced around the store, nodding approvingly. "Looks like you're settling in well." "I am," she said. "It's hard work, but I like it. And it feels good to be doing something normal, you know." The officer nodded. "I'm proud of you. You've come a long way." His words meant more to her than he could possibly know. She had spent so much of her life feeling invisible, like no one cared about her struggles. But this officer had seen her, really seen her, and his kindness had given her the strength to keep going. As they chatted, a customer approached, looking for help finding a specific item. The young woman excused herself and quickly assisted the customer, her confidence growing with each interaction. The officer watched her for a moment, a small smile playing on his lips, before quietly slipping out of the store. That evening, as she walked home from work, she thought about the officer's visit. It had been a small gesture, but it had reminded her that she wasn't alone. She had people rooting for her, people who believed in her. Over the next few weeks, she continued to work hard at the grocery store, but she also started thinking about the future. She wanted more than just a job, she wanted a career, a life she could be proud of. One day, during her lunch break, she mentioned this to Maria. "I've been thinking about going back to school," she said hesitantly. "Maybe taking some classes at the community college. Do you think that's possible?" Maria looked at her thoughtfully. "It's definitely possible. It won't be easy, but if you're willing to put in the work, you can do it. There are even programs that can help with tuition and books." The young woman's eyes lit up. "Really? That sounds amazing. Do you think you could help me figure out how to apply?" Maria smiled. "Of course. Let's sit down after your shift, and I'll show you what you need to do." That evening, Maria helped her fill out an application for the community college and showed her how to apply for financial aid. It felt overwhelming at times, but the young woman was determined. She wanted this more than anything. A few weeks later, she received an acceptance letter from the community college. She couldn't believe it, she was going to be a student. She immediately called Maria to share the news, then decided to visit the officer at the police station. When she arrived, the officer was sitting at his desk, filling out paperwork. He looked up in surprise when he saw her. "Hey," he said, standing up. "What brings you here?" "I got accepted," she said, holding up the letter. "To the community college. I'm going to take classes in the evenings after work." The officer's face broke into a wide grin. "That's incredible. I'm so proud of you." She smiled, tears welling up in her eyes. "I couldn't have done it without you. You believed in me when no one else did." The officer shook his head. "You did this. I just gave you a little push. You're the one who put in the work." They talked for a while, and the officer offered to help her with anything she needed, whether it was advice, a reference, or just someone to talk to. As she left the station, she felt a deep sense of gratitude. She had come so far, and she knew she still had a long way to go, but she was ready for the challenge. That night, as she lay in bed, she thought about everything that had happened over the past few months. She had gone from being homeless and desperate to having a job, a place to stay, and a plan for the future. It hadn't been easy, but it had been worth it. And as she drifted off to sleep, she felt a sense of peace she hadn't felt in years. She knew there would still be obstacles ahead, but she also knew she had the strength to overcome them. Because for the first time in her life, she believed in herself. The young woman's life began to take on a new rhythm. Her days were long. She worked at the grocery store during the day and attended classes at the community college in the evenings, but she didn't mind. Every hour she spent studying or working felt like a step toward a better future. Her classes were challenging, but she was determined to succeed. She studied late into the night, often falling asleep with her textbooks open on her lap. Her favorite class was business management. The professor, a kind woman in her 50s, noticed her dedication and often stayed after class to answer her questions. One evening, after class, the professor approached her. "You're doing really well," she said. "I can tell you're putting in a lot of effort." The young woman smiled, feeling a swell of pride. "Thank you. I really want to do well." The professor nodded. "I can see that. Have you thought about what you want to do after you finish your degree?" The young woman hesitated. "I'm not sure yet. I just know I want to keep moving forward." The professor smiled. "That's a good start. If you ever need advice or guidance, don't hesitate to ask." The young woman left class that night feeling inspired. She had always thought of her education as a way to get a better job, but now she began to dream bigger. Maybe she could start her own business one day. Maybe she could help others who were struggling, just as she had been helped. Meanwhile, the officer continued to check in on her from time to time. He would stop by the grocery store or call her to see how she was doing. Their conversations were always brief, but they meant a lot to her. He had become a steady presence in her life, a reminder that there were good people in the world who cared. One Saturday morning, as she was stocking shelves at the grocery store, the officer walked in. He looked more serious than usual, and she could tell something was on his mind. "Hey," he said, his tone unusually somber. "Do you have a minute to talk?" She nodded, feeling a flicker of concern. "Of course. Is everything okay?" The officer hesitated, then said, "I've been thinking a lot about what you've accomplished. You've come so far, and I'm really proud of you. But I also know how hard it can be to keep going when things get tough." She frowned, unsure of where he was going with this. "Is something wrong?" The officer shook his head. "No, nothing's wrong. I want to make sure you know that you're not alone. If you ever need help, whether it's money, advice, or just someone to talk to, I'm here for you." His words touched her deeply. "Thank you," she said softly. "That means a lot to me." The officer nodded, his expression softening. "You're doing something really brave. Not everyone has the courage to turn their life around like you have. I just want to make sure you know that you've got people rooting for you." She smiled, feeling a surge of gratitude. "I do. And I'll never forget that." As the officer left the store, she felt a renewed sense of determination. She knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but she also knew she had the support she needed to keep going. A few weeks later, she faced her first major setback. She had been studying for a big exam when she received a call from the shelter. They informed her that they were at full capacity and wouldn't be able to accommodate her for much longer. The news hit her hard. She had been saving money, but it wasn't enough to afford an apartment yet. She didn't know what to do. That evening, after class, she decided to call the officer. She hesitated before dialing his number, not wanting to burden him, but she didn't know who else to turn to. "Hey," he said when he answered. "Is everything okay?" She took a deep breath, trying to keep her voice steady. I need your help." She explained the situation, her voice trembling as she spoke. The officer listened quietly, then said, "Don't worry. We'll figure something out." The next day, the officer met her at the shelter. He had spoken to a friend who owned a small apartment building and had arranged for her to stay in one of the units at a reduced rent. "It's not much," he said as he showed her the apartment. "But it's safe, and it's yours." The young woman looked around the small, sparsely furnished apartment, tears filling her eyes. "I don't know how to thank you," she said. The officer smiled. "You don't have to thank me. Just keep doing what you're doing. That's all the thanks I need." As she settled into her new apartment, she felt a mix of emotions: relief, gratitude, and a renewed sense of determination. She knew she had been given a second chance, and she was determined to make the most of it. That night, as she lay in her own bed for the first time in years, she thought about how far she had come. She had faced so many challenges, but she had also experienced so much kindness. And as she drifted off to sleep, she made a promise to herself: one day, she would pay it forward. Because she knew that no matter how hard life got, there was always hope, and there were always people willing to help. The young woman's new apartment became her sanctuary. It was small and modest, but it was hers. For the first time in years, she had a place to call home. She decorated it with a few second-hand items: a cozy blanket, a small potted plant, and a framed picture of a sunset she had found at a thrift store. It wasn't much, but it felt like a fresh start. With a stable place to live, she threw herself even more into her work and studies. Her days were packed: mornings at the grocery store, afternoons studying, and evenings at the community college. It was exhausting, but she didn't mind. Every day felt like progress. One evening, after a particularly grueling class, her professor pulled her aside. "You've been working so hard," she said. "I can see it in your eyes. But don't forget to take care of yourself too." The young woman nodded, though she wasn't entirely sure how to do that. Self-care felt like a luxury she couldn't afford. But the professor's words stuck with her, and she began to make small changes, taking short walks during her breaks, eating healthier meals, and allowing herself an occasional moment to rest. At the grocery store, she continued to impress her coworkers and customers alike. Maria, her manager, noticed her dedication and began giving her more responsibilities. "You've got a good head on your shoulders," Maria said one day. "If you keep this up, you could move up to a supervisor position someday." The young woman smiled, feeling a flicker of pride. "I'd like that," she said. "I want to keep learning and growing." Maria nodded approvingly. "That's the right attitude. Keep it up." Meanwhile, the officer continued to check in on her. He would stop by the grocery store or call her every now and then, just to see how she was doing. Their conversations were always brief but meaningful. He had become a steady presence in her life, a reminder that she wasn't alone. One day, he surprised her with a visit to her apartment. He brought a small housewarming gift, a set of mugs and a box of tea. "I thought you could use something to warm you up on those late study nights," he said with a smile. She laughed, touched by his thoughtfulness. "Thank you. That's really kind of you." They sat at her small kitchen table, sipping tea and talking about her classes, her job, and her plans for the future. The officer listened intently, offering advice and encouragement when she needed it. "You've come so far," he said. "I know it hasn't been easy, but you've handled it all with so much grace." She smiled, feeling a swell of gratitude. "I couldn't have done it without your help. You believed in me when no one else did." The officer shook his head. "You did this. I just gave you a little push. You're the one who put in the work." As he left that evening, she felt a renewed sense of determination. She knew she still had a long way to go, but she also knew she had the strength to keep moving forward. A few weeks later, she faced another challenge. Her car, an old and unreliable vehicle she had bought with her savings, broke down on her way to class. She was stranded on the side of the road, unsure of what to do. Frustrated and overwhelmed, she called the officer. "I don't know what to do," she said, her voice trembling. "I can't afford to fix it, and I need it to get to work and school." The officer listened quietly, then said, "Don't worry. We'll figure something out." True to his word, he helped her find a mechanic who agreed to fix her car at a discounted rate. He even lent her the money to cover the cost, insisting she could pay him back when she was able. "I don't know how to thank you," she said as they stood outside the mechanic's shop. The officer smiled. "You don't have to thank me. Just keep doing what you're doing. That's all the thanks I need." His kindness gave her the strength to keep going. She worked even harder, determined to prove that his faith in her wasn't misplaced. One evening, after a long day at work and school, she received an unexpected call. It was from the community college, informing her that she had been selected for a scholarship. The news left her speechless. "Are you sure?" she asked, her voice shaking. "Yes," the woman on the other end of the line said. "Your hard work and dedication haven't gone unnoticed. This scholarship will cover your tuition for the next semester." Tears filled her eyes as she hung up the phone. She couldn't believe it. This scholarship would ease so much of the financial pressure she had been under. That night, she called the officer to share the news. "I got a scholarship," she said, her voice filled with excitement. The officer's voice broke into a wide grin. "That's incredible. I'm so proud of you." She smiled, tears streaming down her face. "I couldn't have done it without you. You believed in me when no one else did." The officer shook his head. "You did this. I just gave you a little push. You're the one who put in the work." As he left that evening, she felt a renewed sense of determination. She knew she still had a long way to go, but she also knew she had the strength to keep moving forward. A few weeks later, she faced another challenge. Her car, an old and unreliable vehicle she had bought with her savings, broke down on her way to class. She was stranded on the side of the road, unsure of what to do. Frustrated and overwhelmed, she called the officer. "I don't know what to do," she said, her voice trembling. "I can't afford to fix it, and I need it to get to work and school." The officer listened quietly, then said, "Don't worry. We'll figure something out." True to his word, he helped her find a mechanic who agreed to fix her car at a discounted rate. He even lent her the money to cover the cost, insisting she could pay him back when she was able. "I don't know how to thank you," she said as they stood outside the mechanic's shop. The officer smiled. "You don't have to thank me. Just keep doing what you're doing. That's all the thanks I need." His kindness gave her the strength to keep going. She worked even harder, determined to prove that his faith in her wasn't misplaced. One evening, after a long day at work and school, she received an unexpected call. It was from the community college, informing her that she had been selected for a scholarship. The news left her speechless. "Are you sure?" she asked, her voice shaking. "Yes," the woman on the other end of the line said. "Your hard work and dedication haven't gone unnoticed. This scholarship will cover your tuition for the next semester." Tears filled her eyes as she hung up the phone. She couldn't believe it. This scholarship would ease so much of the financial pressure she had been under. That night, she called the officer to share the news. "I got a scholarship," she said, her voice filled with excitement. The officer's voice broke into a wide grin. "That's incredible. I'm so proud of you." She smiled, tears streaming down her face. "I couldn't have done it without you. You believed in me when no one else did." The officer shook his head. "You did this. I just gave you a little push. You're the one who put in the work." As she hung up the phone, she felt a deep sense of gratitude. She had come so far, and she knew she still had a long way to go, but she was ready for the challenge. Because for the first time in her life, she believed in herself, and she knew that no matter what obstacles lay ahead, she could overcome them. The scholarship was a turning point for the young woman. It not only eased her financial burden but also gave her a renewed sense of confidence. She had worked so hard, and now it felt like the universe was finally rewarding her efforts. She continued to excel in her classes, balancing her studies with her job at the grocery store. Life was still demanding, but she had found a rhythm that worked for her. One day, Maria called her into the office at the grocery store. "I've been watching you," Maria said, her tone serious but kind. "You're one of the hardest workers I've ever seen. I think it's time we talked about a promotion." The young woman's eyes widened in surprise. "A promotion?" Maria nodded. "I'd like to offer you the position of assistant manager. It comes with a raise and more responsibility, but I think you're ready for it." The young woman felt a rush of emotions, pride, gratitude, and a little bit of fear. I don't know what to say. "Thank you. I won't let you down." Maria smiled. "I know you won't. You've earned this." The promotion was a game changer. The raise allowed her to start paying back the officer for the car repairs and even save a little extra each month. The new responsibilities at work also gave her a sense of purpose and accomplishment. She was no longer just surviving, she was thriving. As the months went by, she continued to make progress in every area of her life. Her grades at the community college were excellent, and her professors encouraged her to consider transferring to a 4-year university. The idea felt daunting, but also exciting. She began researching schools and scholarships, dreaming of the possibilities. One evening, as she was studying at her kitchen table, there was a knock at her door. She opened it to find the officer standing there, holding a small envelope. "Hey," he said with a smile. "I thought I'd stop by and see how you're doing." She invited him in, and they sat at the table, sipping tea and talking about her classes, her job, and her plans for the future. The officer listened intently, his expression filled with pride. "I brought you something," he said, sliding the envelope across the table. She opened it and found a letter of recommendation he had written for her. It detailed her journey, her resilience, and her determination to turn her life around. "I thought this might help with your university applications," he said. Tears filled her eyes as she read the letter. "Thank you," she said softly. "This means so much to me." The officer smiled. "You've earned it. I've never seen anyone work as hard as you have. I know you're going to do amazing things." His words stayed with her long after he left. She felt a deep sense of gratitude for everything he had done for her, not just the practical help, but the belief he had shown in her when she needed it most. A few weeks later, she received an acceptance letter from a nearby university. They had offered her a partial scholarship, and with the money she had saved, she could afford to attend. She called the officer immediately to share the news. "I got in," she said, her voice filled with excitement. The officer's voice broke into a wide grin. "That's incredible. I'm so proud of you." She smiled, tears streaming down her face. "I couldn't have done it without you. You believed in me when no one else did." The officer shook his head. "You did this. I just gave you a little push. You're the one who put in the work." As she hung up the phone, she felt a deep sense of accomplishment. She had come so far, and she knew she still had a long way to go, but she was ready for the challenge. On her first day at the university, she walked across the campus, taking in the sights and sounds of her new environment. It felt surreal, like a dream she had never dared to imagine. She thought about everything she had overcome, the hunger, the homelessness, the self-doubt, and felt a surge of pride. That evening, as she sat in her dorm room, she wrote a letter to the officer. She poured her heart into it, thanking him for his kindness, his support, and his belief in her. She promised to pay it forward, to help others the way he had helped her. When she finished the letter, she sealed it in an envelope and placed it on her desk. It was a reminder of how far she had come and the people who had helped her along the way. As she lay in bed that night, she thought about the future. She knew there would still be challenges, but she also knew she had the strength to overcome them. Because for the first time in her life, she believed in herself, and she knew that no matter what obstacles lay ahead, she could overcome them. And as she drifted off to sleep, she felt a sense of peace she hadn't felt in years. She had turned her life around, and she was just getting started.